And here we are in the final lesson of this course. This is where we implement what we've learned and apply color correction to our artwork. For a better explanation, I will start with luminosity, then saturation, and finally hue. This is the order I follow in my work, as I found that it helps me color correct my artworks faster, as it reduces a lot of back and forth. Remember, we should always use one of the photos in the composite as a reference, and match the rest to it. For this lesson, we'll be using the photo of the woman. Okay, let's correct the luminosity first. We know that luminosity is how bright or dark a hue is. And we also know that different images most probably have a different dynamic range. So we need to look at the dynamic range of each photo and match it to our reference. When working with luminosity, I like to put a black and white adjustment layer on top of everything to remove all color information. Without the distraction of the hues, it's much easier to focus on the luminance and spot differences in the dynamic ranges. The dynamic range of our reference image is very wide between the midtones and shadows and much narrower between the midtones and highlights. Also, the brightest parts are almost pure white, and the darkest parts are almost pure black. Now, we need to check the other images one by one, and adjust the dynamic range to match the darkest parts, the brightest parts, and the midtones to those of the reference image. To fix the dynamic range, I use a levels adjustment layer. As explained earlier, there are different ways to do this, but I like the levels tool as it's very easy to use. The levels tool gives you control of the overall dynamic range and lets you tweak the shadows, midtones, and highlights separately. I set the blend mode of the levels layer to luminosity, and this is very important. In this way, the levels are only applied to the luminosity, and the hues are not affected. Okay, so let's match the background first. If we look at the shadows and highlights of the background, we can see that they almost have the same tone as the reference image. The midtones, however, are too light, so we need to darken them to match them with the ones of the woman. So what we need to do is expand the range between the midtones and the shadows, to match the dynamic range with that of the woman's photo. This is with the luminosity adjustment. And this is without. Without the adjustment. That's already looking better. We can also notice that once we did that, the details on the archways popped out more. Now let's jump to another photo. Keep in mind that we can always go back and refine more. Let's have a look at the tiger in the front. Compared to the woman, this photo is looking a bit flat. The shadows are a bit lighter than the ones of the reference, so let's darken them a bit. Also, the midtones are too light, so we need to make them darker, by enlarging the dynamic range between the shadows and the midtones. On the other hand, the brighter parts look very similar, so we can leave the highlights as they are. So it was just a bit of darkening of the midtones and shadows for this one. This is with the luminosity tweaks. And without the tweaks. Next, the tiger on the left. Okay, so the brightest areas seem to match, however, the shadows need to be darker. So let's boost them a bit. The midtones need to be a bit darker as well. So, we need to expand the range between the shadows and the midtones. And voila! Again, with luminosity correction. Without luminosity correction. Without the correction. And the last luminosity correction, the tiger on the right. Here too, the brightest points look similar, but again, the shadows and midtones need to be darkened a bit. Let's go. And boom. With the correction. And without. Without the correction. Let's have a look at the overall result. This is the before. And this is after our luminosity corrections. I think we can agree that we have much better blending, and all photos look like they belong together. Now our artwork looks as if a photographer set the scene and took a picture. There is one last thing I want to do before we move on. I'm going to go ahead and reduce the overall darkness of the midtones as they seem a bit too dark. But I'm only going to lighten it a little bit, as I don't want the artwork to become flat. I think that's enough. It just needed brightening a touch. This is with the lighter midtones. And without. Without the adjustment. But now that we're done with luminosity, let's turn the colors back on and move to the second property of color. Saturation is the second property that we'll be tackling in our color correction process. If you remember, saturation is the intensity or vividness of a hue. Sometimes the colors of a particular asset might be too vibrant and overpowering. And sometimes it's the other way round, the colors are too dim. That's where we need to correct the saturation. But how do we know how saturated colors should be? Well, the aim of color correction is to match the colors between objects while making them look as realistic as possible. So a good starting point is to make the colors as true to life as much as we can. Of course, you can make your own stylistic choices, and there might be occasions where you can push boundaries. However, the majority of the time, you'll want your work to look natural. Moving on. Looking at the colors in our artwork, I can see that the tiger on the right is a bit too saturated compared to the woman, so let's desaturate it a bit. Yes, that's better. I'd like to point out that if we set the blend mode of the hue and saturation adjustment layer to color, the changes would not affect the luminosity, but only the color. Let's see the before and after. This is with the saturation adjustment. And this is without. Without the desaturation. One might argue that in real life, the color of a tiger could look as saturated as it was before correcting it. So why did we change it? Well, that's true, but when doing color correction, we need to take a holistic approach. We need to consider not only all the individual assets but also the overall scene. In this case, since we have a very neutral environment with mostly blacks, whites, and grays, our colors should be slightly desaturated to match. Also, this helps to create a dramatic mood that complements the composition. Now that I can see everything in context, I think that the blues of the dress and the throne are a bit too vibrant. This would be a good time to dim them a bit by desaturating the cyans. I know that we've been using the photo of the woman as a reference, however, that does not mean that we can't tweak it. The tigers look fine as they are, and don't require further saturation adjustments. Therefore, we're all done from a saturation point of view. This is with the saturation tweaks. And without. Without the tweaks. The saturation corrections for our composite all required desaturation. This means that we essentially added gray to the colors to reduce their intensity or vividness. To do this, I used a hue and saturation adjustment layer on top of the asset layer, and set it as a clipping mask. Of course, sometimes, you might need to increase the saturation rather than reduce it. And again, this depends on the assets you are using and the scene in your artwork. If our artwork were set in a jungle, for instance, we might have needed to increase the saturation instead. Remember, our aim is to blend all images together while making them look as realistic as possible. And as always, the more you practice, the better you'll become at picking what color correction is needed. Once your eyes are trained, and you know the basic tools, color correction becomes effortless. Now that our saturation correction is ready and the intensity of all the colors in our artwork matches, we can jump to our last color correction property. The last installment of this section is about correcting hues. The hue and saturation tool I used to change the saturation in the previous lesson, as the name implies, is also used to change the hue. And although there are different Photoshop tools one can use, I'm using the same tool for this lesson. Because hue and saturation go hand in hand, some people tend to fix both of them simultaneously. But as we're following a structured process and tackling each color property individually, we did not touch the hues in the previous lesson, and that's what we'll be doing next. Okay, so we mentioned that hue is the actual color or a shade of a color. When adjusting a hue, we are essentially changing the values of that color to a neighboring hue in the color spectrum. So if we look at this color wheel, and let's say our hue is red, by moving the hue to the left, our red color will start becoming more orange, and eventually yellow, etc. And if we move it to the right, it starts getting more purple, then violet, and so on. Now, how does hue correction come into play in photo manipulation? Well, since we are compositing photos that have been shot under different conditions, they will all have individual color characteristics and different hues. So we need to correct them to match. Sometimes, you might have an asset with a warmer color temperature, which means it has more reds and yellows, or a colder color temperature with more blues and greens. It could also have other hues to it, as this is affected by the lighting conditions, the scene itself, and any image treatment applied to it by the photographer. You've probably noticed how in real life, light takes on a different color at different times of the day. It's warm at sunrise and sunset and more neutral in the middle of the day. And in the shade or on a cloudy day, it has a colder hue. Indoors, light also has different hues, mainly depending on the type of artificial lighting used. We sometimes don't notice this because our brains are very good at normalizing different lighting conditions to make everything look like daylight. However, when separate photos from different scenarios are put in one composite, this becomes more evident. In Section 2, we learned how light bounces off objects. We need to understand that when light bounces off an object, it also reflects the color of that same object. And when that reflection hits another object, it will affect the hue of the object it's hitting. So, let's use an example. Let's say we have a tiger walking on grass. When the light bounces off the grass, it reflects the green hue of the grass. And when that reflected light hits the tiger, although the tiger still looks white and orange, those colors now have some green hues. It is vital that when correcting hues, we keep in mind the reference image but also the overall scene. Every artwork is different, so we have to imagine how our assets would look in that specific scenario. In our case, color-wise, we have a very neutral environment. The light is pure white, and the bounces hitting the wall and floor are also white, so we don't have any color casts. We do have black tiles, but they won't reflect onto the assets because black absorbs light. If our floor were grass, it would be a different story. We would have needed to lightly paint the color of the grass on several parts of the assets, to blend them with the environment. Okay, let's go back where we left off. If we closely examine the individual assets, we can see that they all have a different subtle color cast. And it's good to point out that usually, only very slight adjustments are required to correct the hue. If we make drastic adjustments, the colors will look off. So let's correct our hues. Looking at our artwork, I can see that the ceiling area has a faint reddish hue, which I like. However, the woman is a bit too yellow, so I'll change that yellow and make it more red. That will help to better gel the woman with the background. Yes, that's better. It's very, very subtle, but it's there. Sometimes, you really need to look closely to see the change, but these minor individual adjustments make a huge difference in the artwork as a whole. Although the woman is our primary reference, the light conditions in our composite are dictated by the background image, as it's the environment in our scene. And that's why I chose to adjust the hues of the woman. Okay, let's move on to the tigers. We'll do the tiger in the front first. It seems to have a bit of a green or yellow cast, so I need to change that and make it more red. That's looking better, but now I need to reduce the saturation a bit because the change bumped it up a little. Okay, that's perfect. This is with the hue correction. Without hue correction. Without the correction. The tiger on the right is not bad at all, however I'm going to make it just a bit more red. With the correction. And without. Without the correction. The tiger on the left is definitely looking off. It has a green-yellow cast which we'll need to adjust and make more red. Better, however the saturation was affected again, so I'm going to increase the saturation just a notch. This is with the more reddish cast. And without. Without the reddish cast. Also, we need to adjust the luminosity of the facial area above the nose, as it's a bit too dark. I've added a black and white layer with a luminosity blending mode, and then masked that part only. Looking good. That's all about color correction. This is the before. And this is our final artwork. After you're done with the overall color correction, you might need to go back and refine specific areas. When doing so, make use of masks so that you only affect the desired parts. There are times when you want to target a specific color. In that case, in the Hue and Saturation Adjustment layer, simply change the selection from Master, which affects all the colors, to the color you want from the drop-down menu. I did this when desaturating the woman's dress. You can also use the Color Balance Adjustment layer, which focuses on the highlights, midtones, and shadows. Although I did not use it for this artwork, Color Balance is also my go-to tool for correcting hues. Photoshop is a vast application, and it has various tools for color correction. Whichever your preferred tools are, knowing how to use HSL is the key to accurate color correction. And remember that the aim of color correction is to blend every asset together so that the final artwork looks like one photo.